I want to tell you a little, first I want to start off with a story. A couple of years ago, a man came into the office where I worked. I was at a small nonprofit at the time. And he was seeking an expungement. You see, his criminal record was plaguing him. Back when he was 18 years old, this man had swiped a single bottle of Mick Golden Light from a gas station refrigerator in a failed and foolish attempt to impress a girl at a house party. He didn't make it to the end of the lot before he was nabbed. He was charged with a misdemeanor theft, pled down to a petty, cut a check, and thought he was done with it. Now, in his 30s, he's decided that he wants to become a cop, only to find out that his prior criminal history, that petty misdemeanor theft, is a permanent prohibitor from ever becoming a peace officer. More recently, I heard another story by another man. When he was 17 years old, he and 7 of his close guy friends, so 8 teenage boys, decided that they would break into a local liquor distribution plant. They hatched out this plan over the course of several months. They had a walkie-talkie and a decoy van. They had a mock-up of the blueprint of the inside of the building so they would know exactly where to go for those returnables. You can stack them and run, and schnapps for the girls. After several months of planning, they pulled it off. They took a hacksaw to the side of the building, broke in and got away with a load of beer and schnapps. They broke into a local cabin and stashed their loot. They sat on it until the hubbub had died down. Once it did, he said, they threw an epic senior party. But perhaps what's most interesting about that story was that these were transferable skills. The attention to detail, the plotting, the delayed gratification, even an interest in criminology. Perhaps it's no surprise, he said, that 2 of us are now chiefs of police. One's a college professor, one's a victim's advocate, one's a nurse, and so on, but importantly, 2 are now chiefs of police. And let me tell you, this was far more than a single bottle of beer that they took. Now, while these stories have many similarities, for starters, the teenage propensity to believe that stolen booze can impress anybody, there are also some very important distinctions. For example, our 8 burglars were all white and solidly situated within the middle class. Our 40 filcher was not. And one more important distinction is that the man who filched that 40 was caught, and he will forever pay for that offense. And our 8 burglars were not. And the only time that they need to be reminded of their prior crime is over beers at a ball game. Tonight I want to talk to you about this project that I've been working on. It's an examination of stories like those 8 burglars, people who have gotten away with it. In doing so, We Are All Criminals seeks to provide another way of examining the true and disparate impact of our criminal justice system and our juvenile justice system upon poor communities and communities of color and American Indians throughout the United States. But first, I want to make sure we're all on the same page. This is a graph taken from the Sentencing Project's Trends in U.S. Corrections. You can see it shows the U.S. state and federal prison population between 1925 and 2013. And by and large, for the first part of that graph, it remains pretty much the same, barring for some general population growth. Then, about 4 decades ago, actually more than that, we began this deliberate and regrettable march toward that, the caging of more than 1.5 million people across the United States. But what's more concerning, at least to me, is that even once people are released from prison, the punishment doesn't end. That's when people find that they may no longer be locked up, but now they're locked out. They can't find housing or employment, can't get into school. And before I talk about those collateral sanctions or consequences, the ways in which our criminal justice system and criminal records can curtail one's liberties, I think what's important is to look at this graph once more and recognize what is not shown. So again, this is the US state and federal prison population. In other words, people who are behind bars right now in prison. It doesn't show, for example, the millions of people who are in jails, in immigration detention centers, in military prisons or civil commitments. It doesn't show the kids who are in juvenile detention. It doesn't show the 7 million people who are on probation and parole under the thumb of the criminal justice system, but not spending the night behind bars. It doesn't also show the 65 million people across the United States who carry the burden of a criminal record, who live with the legacy of that interaction with the criminal justice system. They are not shown here on this graph. And just as importantly, it doesn't show the nearly 3 million sons and daughters who are without their parents because they are incarcerated. It doesn't show the countless brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, spouses and partners, and greater community members who are all profoundly impacted when somebody is taken out of the home and not allowed back in. They are not shown here on this graph. And so while it initially looks like a tsunami of humanity ready to crash upon our shores, you realize that it is just a drop in a much larger ocean of crisis. That crisis is not felt proportionally throughout our system, or throughout our society. For example, more than 12 million people are arrested each year in the United States. 80% of them are eligible for public defense. In some jurisdictions, that means that you make less than $3,000 a year. Can you fathom that level of poverty? And keep in mind that not everybody who is in jail is guilty. In fact, according to the Vera Institute, 3 out of 5 people who are in jail are legally presumed innocent and simply too poor to post even low bail. Now, not everybody who's innocent ends up in jail. Some end up in the morgue or in the hospital. Like Mr. Patel, the Gujarati grandfather who was visiting his family in Alabama. He was out for a walk one morning when police called in a suspicious man walking down the streets. Police responded with force, leaving a 57-year-old man partially paralyzed and his family scared to death of the police. He was, as many people throughout the country are, seen as always already guilty of something, guilty of anything. That presumption of guilt is not felt, is not evenly distributed throughout the country. Again, from the Sentencing Project's Trends in U.S. Corrections, you can see that the lifetime likelihood of imprisonment for black men, for example, is 1 in 3. 1 in 3. Meanwhile, for white women such as myself, it's 1 in 111. Now, that's quite a cushion. That's not to say that white women aren't committing crimes. Yet, a look at, say, our war on drugs, perhaps one of the greatest contributors to our current carceral crisis, would show that while usage rates may remain the same or very similar, our arrest rates, our charging rates, and our conviction rates are wildly disproportionate. Additionally, some of the greatest drug usage is among affluent teens. And yet that's not who you see in our juvenile justice system, and then it's not who you see in our criminal justice system. But for those kids who do become embroiled in our system, understand that even now, those juvenile records, there is no shredder large enough to destroy them. There's no funeral pyre that we can toss them upon. Now we have, this is the data age, right? And this criminal record, a juvenile record, can stamp upon the ether a scarlet letter that cannot be scrubbed clean. Now, it's no small number of individuals who are caught up in the system. According to the National Employment Law Project, 1 in 4 of us carries a criminal record. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, that number may be closer to 1 in 3, and those waters just keep rising. Criminal records are affected by collateral sanctions which prohibit individuals from living in certain places or working in certain fields or facilities. Almost every aspect of our lives can be affected by criminal records. For example, the ability to find gainful employment, safe and affordable housing, professional licensure, whether it be practicing law or emptying a bedpan, the ability to receive government assistance or education. The Common Application Form, the form that's used by more than 500 colleges and universities nationwide to determine the makeup of next year's new admissions, asks the question, have you ever been convicted or adjudicated delinquent of an offense? Yes or no? Can you fathom your ability to access education limited to a checked box, yes or no? And while a college may say that that's just one variable in a much larger algorithm that determines who would be a best fit, make no mistake the chilling effect that that question has on individuals who carry a record, because unlike employment, here you have to pay to be denied. $20, $30, $50, $60 a shot, just to be told that you're not a good fit for our campus. This at a time when there's no social science research that shows prior criminal history has any bearing on future campus safety, and at a time when countless research shows that the access to education can be one of the greatest determining factors in a reduced recidivism rate. We should be pushing kids into school rather than locking them out. The ability to immigrate, to stay in the United States, to petition family to join you, impacted by the presence of a criminal record. The ability to travel, the ability to vote, to participate in the civic process, impacted by a criminal record. Now, this is just 8 of the more than thousands of ways that people's lives can be impacted, both by sanction and by greater social stigma, because of a criminal record. So it's nearly every aspect of who we are and how we are, from psychological to social, from personal to professional, confined and defined by our criminal histories, by something that we've done in the past. But not for everyone. In fact, just for a few of us. Just for 1 in 4 of us. For the other 75% of us, we've had the luxury to be introduced as fellows rather than felons. I wanted to know if anybody would join me in this little experiment of examining how lives would have been different had we been caught. So I drew up a flyer that said, quite simply, we are all criminals. What have you had the luxury to forget? I sent it out through our social service network at the nonprofit where I worked. But I asked our network not to respond, because I didn't want to hear from people I already knew. Instead, I asked them to forward it on to their coffee clubs, their colleges, their church groups, their neighborhood organizations. And to my unending surprise, the phone actually started to ring. So I bought a camera and a recorder. I hopped in my hatchback and drove all across the state, and now all across the United States, interviewing people in cars and bars, in parks and diners and offices, anywhere where someone might feel comfortable enough to disclose to me something that they've otherwise had the luxury to either forget or at least be forgiven for. I then took mugshots of pictures of individuals in ways that I hope relay an individuality and a personality, maybe even a little humanity, but of course without identity. You can find the first 80 of these interviews on the website at weareallcriminals.org. If you go on there, and I encourage you to do so, you'll find a wide range in the severity of offenses that were disclosed, from aggravated robbery, it's fairly significant, to relatively innocuous. Open bottle, that was carrying from one house party to the next. Petty theft, that was a failure to return a library book, that is an offense. And public urination. This gentleman now has a contract to work with the Department of Defense, some of the highest security clearance in the nation. Had he been caught, he would find difficulty getting a job at a gas station. You'll also find a wide range in the responses to the recollection of past transgressions. Like this gentleman who recalled a time that he had taken his uncle's hunting rifle out to college with him. Drunk one night, he and his roommates decided to liberate the money within a double-posted parking meter. One drunken shot went right through the locking mechanism, letting loose $40 worth of quarters. He laughed throughout his entire interview. And then there are some who wept throughout theirs, like this woman who recalled a time when she was working as a barista. She used to pad her tips with bills from the till. She cried as she told me this, saying, "I cannot fathom what life would be like right now had I been labeled a thief then." There are some that recognize that crime is an event in the life course, not a static characteristic of one's being. And then there are some that have truly heartbreaking stories, or at least in my opinion they are. And you can read the full story online. The abbreviated version is this. When he was 14 years old, his family moved to an even rougher neighborhood than they had been in before. Within the first few weeks, he had found himself mugged and beaten several times. Before long, he noticed that when he hung out around a certain group of guys, the beating stopped. So by the time he turned 15, he decided to join a gang. Now, that didn't come for free, and the price was exacted one regrettable Saturday day. He was told that if he didn't participate in the beating of a rival gang member, a child that looked a lot like him, that he would instead be beaten. He made the choice that he says he has regretted every day since. In fact, he says he sometimes wakes up in the middle of the night screaming, thinking that it's all happening again. He picked up that pipe and he hit that child. Had he been caught, he would have been charged with first-degree assault for the benefit of a gang. He would have been certified to stand trial as an adult, where he would have been convicted. He would have then entered the cycle of in prison, out of prison, in prison, out of prison, in prison, out of prison that happens to millions of people across the United States. He wasn't caught. He graduated from high school. He received a scholarship to go to college where he said that for the first time in his life, he was able to concentrate. He could read an entire paragraph. He could finish a math problem. For the first time in his life, he said he wasn't constantly checking over his shoulder to see what was coming next. His grades skyrocketed. He graduated from college, went on to graduate school, and now has a PhD in biophysics. Now, I'm not saying that that couldn't have happened had he been caught, but it is highly unlikely. And I'm also not saying that we should somehow forget about the harm that's done. At no point am I saying that there aren't people who have been severely victimized in this country every day. What I am saying is that when we construct those consequences to that harm, they must be rational. They must be reasonable. They must be proportionate. They must be merciful. And above all else, there must be an end. Because without hope, what does one have? Time and again, I heard that people engaged in criminal activities so that they could feel like they were part of a social circle, like this gentleman who donated some of his FAFSA funds to help finance a collegiate drug ring, or this woman who said that she sold weed to frat bros and football players so that she could get a hey, what's up in the hallway. She said she was sick of feeling invisible. And then there are some stories that I can't believe we're even still talking about in 2015, like this woman, who said that her husband had been diagnosed with a particularly aggressive and terminal form of cancer. The year before, he had been an active Marine, ostensibly at the peak of his physical career. And now he was so crippled in pain that he couldn't unfurl his hand enough to shampoo his own hair or to hold a pencil. She said the only thing that could assuage his pain was pot. Now, he couldn't smoke it. She had asthma. So she put the pot in the butter and the butter in the brownies, and together they would eat it. She said that just for a moment, he could relax enough to hold her hand. He died. Her life stopped. She doesn't remember what she did with the pot. Maybe she used it. She doesn't think so. Maybe her friends did. That's more likely, she said. Maybe she threw it away. It didn't matter. The point was her husband had just died. Is that a story you think you can use, she said. And I told her about a woman who had recently contacted me. A few years back, her son, with whom she was living, in his mid-40s, had been diagnosed with a particularly aggressive and terminal form of cancer. Within the last few months of his life, his body was so riddled in pain that it's like he wasn't even present. She didn't have asthma, so he smoked the pot, the only thing that could assuage that pain. And when he did, she said, it was like her baby was finally back with her again. He died. Her life stopped. She didn't move his work boots from the back door or his toothbrush from the bathroom sink, and she didn't throw out the baggies of pot that were in the freezer. A few months after he passed, a search warrant was executed on her home. Police tore apart the apartment and found the baggies of pot in the freezer. She was charged and convicted with a felony possession of controlled substances. She lost her housing. This woman is 72 years old. She has no prior criminal record, and she's living on the streets. We Are All Criminals seeks to remind viewers that while we have all done something that we're not proud of, each and every one of us, much more importantly, we're all human. And some of us may be in need of a second chance. But this project is also a commentary on the disparate impact of our policies, policing, and prosecution. Many, not all, but many of the participants have benefited from belonging to a race and class that is not overrepresented in our criminal justice system. And some people are pretty straight up about that. Others just can't imagine what life would be like now had they been caught then. Like the woman for whom I took this photograph. She said that when she was 16 years old, she was a bit of a nerd, a chemistry buff. One bored July day, she and some of her friends decided that they would make their own homemade napalm, which apparently you can do with just a few common household ingredients. They whipped up this highly flammable viscous gel in an apple cider glass jar, took it out to a state park where they found the small, ideal enclosed space upon which they could test their substance. They doused the inside of the porta potty with this substance, lit a tennis ball on fire, lobbed it in, and watched it blow. They then ran back to their cars and drove the speed limit the entire way home, terrified of what had just happened. The day that I interviewed her, that morning, she had been keeping a 3-month-old heart alive with her index finger, feeding it for the baby. She's a pediatrician. In many jurisdictions, an arson, which would be the destruction of a structure with a homemade explosive, is a permanent barrier from working with vulnerable individuals, most definitely children. It wouldn't have mattered that she was just a kid when it happened. It wouldn't have mattered that no one got hurt. It wouldn't have mattered that she was terribly sorry for what she had done. All that would have mattered was that the act occurred and she was caught, and she would be permanently barred from working with kids. It gives you pause, doesn't it? Or at least I think it should. When you consider all of the waste when we're foreclosing futures before brains are even fully developed. Here's what I hope. I hope that people see a bit of themselves in this project. I hope that in that reflection, people take note of the context that they've allowed themselves. I was young, I was drunk, I was stupid. I was in a bad relationship. I gave it back anyway. No one got hurt. It wasn't my idea. Whatever that context is, recognize that it may have existed for someone who was caught as well. Now, it's not an excuse, but it is an opportunity to recognize a common humanity. I hope that some recognize the privilege that they've experienced and appreciate that not everyone has benefited from that same privilege. And I hope that viewers reflect upon how very patently different their own lives could have been had they been caught, and consider the lives of all of those who have been. Finally, I hope that this encourages people to take action. Permanent and public criminal records perpetuate inequities, precluding millions of people across the U.S. from countless opportunities to move on and move up. This project questions the wisdom and the fairness in those policies. Now, to top it all off, many of us in this room are complicit in this. As members of the bench and bar, we've either created it or perpetuated it or stood silently by, claiming no stake in the game. Too often we've said, This is their problem. I would ask that you tonight say that this is our problem, and together we'll be a part of the solution. Now, there are many ways to do that, right? Legislative change is one great idea. We could start with the war on drugs or the disrupting the school-to-prison pipeline. But first, I would ask that you consider what your own chalkboard might say. What's your story? What have you had the luxury to forget? And then consider what life would be like if that mugshot were to be your introduction into the social world. If it eclipsed your Facebook pic, your LinkedIn profile pic. If it took over all of those other moments that you hold so dear and use to define yourself, perhaps your wedding or your graduation. What if, instead of the photos that you now have framed, instead, it was a mugshot? I think that once you can appreciate we are all criminals, you can truly understand that we are all human. And some of us, perhaps 1 in 4 of us, may be in need of a second chance. And then keep thinking, because chances are you've forgotten quite a bit. Thank you.